We've seen a raft of incredibly powerful tools at writing software. There are some leading voices in the software development community that have essentially declared writing code as no longer a human task.
Welcome to AI Council Code. I'm your host, Maggie Welsh, and I'm here today with Parker Hancock. And we're going to be talking about what to expect with AI law in 2026. We had the pleasure of having Parker on the podcast last year, and I'm very happy to welcome him back today to talk about this year ahead.
Baker Botts, LLP, provides podcasts for educational purposes only. They are not legal advice and are not intended to establish an attorney client relationship. This communication may constitute attorney advertising.
Hi, my name is Parker Hancock. I'm one of the AI governance lawyers here at Baker Botts.
So last year in 2025, we talked about some of your predictions with respect to AI law. We talked about the tech and DeepSeek was just coming out at that time. We talked about the EU AI Act and some of the regulations that we were thinking were going to come out throughout the year. How did your predictions hold up? What did you get right with respect to what happened last year in 2025?
Absolutely, Maggie. I think this is going to be a great annual tradition to do our look ahead and see how well we did in the year that followed. Last year, as we were sitting at the beginning of 2025, on the tech front, we really saw that reasoning models were the next big thing. We were going to see advanced capabilities come out from models that could think for a really long time and do tasks over longer time horizons, things that looked more like coworkers in the AI space. And that has largely held up. We'll talk in a minute about where that trend goes next, but I feel confident that prediction was fulfilled. On the regulatory front, I think we saw a lot of what we expected. We saw a focus on the states looking to mitigate specific pinpoint risks they were worried about with AI. We saw the Colorado AI Act that was focused on bias and prejudice. We saw California put into effect its automated decision making rules. And we saw Texas pass a relatively comprehensive Responsible AI Governance Act as well. So I think that was largely correct. One of the things that we'll talk about when we get to governance themes is how that seems to be changing in view of the new administration and its perspectives on AI.
Well, it sounds like you got a lot right for the last year, so congratulations. We talked about some of the things that you missed, though, so let's let our viewers know, what did we miss or get wrong last year?
The biggest thing that we're still missing is a definitive ruling on copyright and large language model training. In the United States, everyone's entitled to their decade in court, and that has been the case. I think we expected more substantive rulings on where the limits of the ability to use copyrighted materials in model training would be. That just hasn't happened yet. There are still a lot of cases that are in discovery, cases that are moving forward, but we've yet to see any definitive statements. We've seen a couple of settlements, but nothing to rely on going forward.
Do you see that coming in 2026?
I think that most AI companies are content to keep moving forward, even in the lack of clear guidance because of the massive capital pouring into this market. On the other hand, I think we will see more settlements. One of the major frontier labs entered a huge settlement with a batch of authors late last year. And it's more likely that we see the big frontier labs settle their class actions than see definitive rulings. But we're just going to have to let things play out.
So you mentioned, and I know we talked about last year it being the year of agentic AI. I know that we come a long way in 2025, but what does agentic AI look like now? Where are we with that?
I think as we stand here, we have a clearer definition of what we mean when we talk about an agent, which is a large language model capable of calling tools that can have impacts in data systems or in the real world, like reading a file, running a test suite, updating a customer record, those sorts of things. And we've seen tremendous progress. I think where we've seen the most progress is on the agentic coding front. At the end of the year, we've seen a raft of incredibly powerful tools at writing software. There are some leading voices in the software development community that have essentially declared writing code as no longer a human task, including a gentleman named Andre Karpathy, who coined the term vibe coding about a year ago, organizer and orchestrator of agents who do coding at his direction. I think that has been the big theme of the end of the year. But looking forward, I think we're going to see that same technology and those same sorts of agents have impacts far beyond coding. And what I've been telling my clients that sort of look at this and they're like, well, my business is not coding. Why is this relevant to me? If you think about code as the way of expressing in human language a business process, What I think we're going to see is software development. If that's your industry, you're going to have coding agents do that. But when you're interacting with systems, when you're sitting in front of a computer doing things, reading email, those are things that coding agents can do as well. So it's a much more general purpose technology. We've seen one of the major frontier labs just in the last few weeks, as we sit here recording this on January 29th, release or attempt to release something that is a non-coding version of the most popular coding product to try to get more use by people who don't think of themselves as programmers or coders, but to leverage that same kind of technology in their daily work.
So, what should in house counsel be thinking about when we're talking about this agentic technology and some of these vibe coding and coding agents that are out in the market?
Yeah, so I think if last year and the couple of years prior were focused on what the AI inference vendors could do with your data, like could they train their models on it? What were the confidentiality terms? I think moving forward, that's still going to be relevant, but instead, we're now going to be talking about how agents interact with all of the rest of your systems. And that's going to present itself in two different ways. One of them is how do you allow agents to safely access your systems of record, your document management, your CRM, your ERP systems? How do you manage that data interaction? And also, how do you harden them against agents doing things that are unexpected? There's been a lot of instances of people running coding agents, and the coding agent gets confused and deletes important files or blanks out a database or does some destructive act that, if that were to happen in a production environment, could be devastating. And so I think that the two things you really need to look at is disaster recovery and hardening your systems of record against agents working on them, and also starting to look at that interface of not just where your company interfaces with your AI vendor, but where those AI agent systems are going to be interfacing with all of the rest of your systems.
And thinking about that accountability, is there a good takeaway or key piece that in house counsel can be focusing on there? Because I know a lot of the questions is just how are agents going to be held accountable? And a lot of that we just still don't know.
California specifically has now passed a law that says you can't blame AI. It reminds me of an old IBM manual that used to say a computer can never make a management decision because a computer can never be held accountable. In the same way, the biggest trend I see in AI governance is not issues with AI violating AI specific laws, but AI taking actions that violate existing laws. Ultimately, the company is going to be held accountable. Within a company, there has to be a human, an employee, a leader somewhere that is accountable for what the AIs at their disposal are actually doing. Even as powerful as these systems are, that old wisdom from the IBM manual still holds true. You can't hold a computer accountable. You can only hold businesses and the people within them accountable. So that's what I would keep in mind.
And you mentioned AI governance. What are concerns with AI governance right now?
One of the biggest flashpoints right now is in employment, an example of AI violating non AI laws, right? So there's a number of class actions that relate to automated systems, AI systems for reviewing resumes and making initial decisions about who is actually going to be reviewed by a human. And there's two big takeaways from that. The first one is that in one specific case, the vendor, like most, had in their contract, they said, we're a tool, you're the decision maker. We don't have any liability for what our tool says because ultimately that decision rests with you. But they were screening resumes. And so what the court said is, even though that's what the contract said, you were acting as an agent of your customer and making decisions on their behalf. And so we are not going to prevent you from facing liability for the decisions that your AI makes. In that particular case, the issue was garden variety employment discrimination. One of the places where we see an AI war really heat up is in the employment space, because you have prospective employees using AIs to write cover letters, write resumes, fill out applications, et cetera. And you have employers that are faced with an almost impossible task of a deluge of resumes and trying to find signal in that noise in a way that isn't going to create legal liability. I would say the biggest concern for me right now, and what I talk to my clients about, is how do we make sure that our AIs are obeying the law? How are we making sure that they fit within the existing legal frameworks?
So, speaking of AI wars that you're talking about, let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the US with respect to the federal level and state level of AI regulations.
Yeah, that has been particularly fascinating. And then there's two things I want to talk about. As many of y'all know, the current administration is very bullish on the future of AI and how strategically important it is to United States domestic and foreign policy. There's a new executive order that goes beyond the old Biden order, which it replaces, to try and open things up for AI, including the FTC has been instructed to release guidance on when federal law might trump state laws that are attempting to regulate AI. So the FTC is trying to use its federal preemption to essentially quash state laws that would potentially restrict AI development. One of the places where this tension is most acute is the Colorado AI Act, which was supposed to go into effect February 1 and has now been delayed until June, was supposed to require AIs to essentially not discriminate against protected classes, to have protections against bias and prejudice. What the administration has said is that no state can create a regulation that would prevent an AI from telling the truth. Now, many of us might not see a tension there, but the implicit tension is that in order to modify it to fit one, you might be modifying in a way that would violate the other. That's a philosophical discussion that goes way beyond this. But in terms of watching the development of the law, there's clearly the federal government is trying to step in and quash attempts by states to limit AI deployment and the regulation of AI.
Thank you so much, Parker, for those helpful insights. Any final advice or thoughts for 2026 for our listeners?
I think that the two big takeaways for me is one, the challenges of AI deployment are moving from how you deal with your model vendor to how your model vendor interacts with everything else. Your focus should primarily be on how your AIs interact with existing legal frameworks and existing actions. Agentic systems, as they act in the real world, are going to run up against existing laws. So that should be the focus as well. Also, stay posted, pay attention to this podcast and other thought leadership coming out of BakerBots because we are tracking these developments. It is still a very dynamic space.
Thank you, Parker, and thanks to our listeners. We're so glad that you joined us today. And as Parker said, stay tuned for additional podcasts and more insights on AI legal issues from Baker Bots.
Thank you for listening to this Baker Bots podcast. Baker Bots has the experience, knowledge, and people to address our clients' most significant legal issues. For more information on Baker Bots practices, please visit us at bakerbots.com. This presentation is provided by Baker Bots LLP for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship. Under the rules of certain jurisdictions, this communication may constitute attorney advertising.